There are some stories from history that are so dark, so twisted, that they seem almost impossible to believe. Stories that make you question the very nature of evil itself. Today, we're traveling back to the early 1800s, to a remote stretch of land along the Delaware-Maryland border, a place where travelers disappeared without a trace, where families were torn apart in the dead of night, and where one woman built an empire on the suffering of others. This is the story of Patty Cannon, a name that once struck fear into the hearts of anyone who dared travel through her territory, a woman who has been called one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, a monster who preyed on the most vulnerable and got away with it for decades. But who was Patty Cannon? How did she get away with her crimes for so long? And what finally brought her reign of terror to an end? Stay with me, because this case is darker than you might imagine. Our story begins in the late 1700s. Patty Cannon's exact birth date remains a mystery, like so much of her early life. Some historians believe she was born around 1769 or 1770, possibly in Canada, though even this is uncertain. What we do know is that by the early 1800s, Patty Cannon had established herself in one of the most strategic and dangerous locations imaginable. Picture this: the Delaware-Maryland border, a place where jurisdiction was murky at best, where state laws clashed and law enforcement was virtually non-existent. It was the perfect hiding place for someone with dark intentions. And Patty Cannon knew exactly how to use this to her advantage. She operated a tavern, a seemingly innocent roadside inn that catered to travelers making their way through this remote area. On the surface, it looked like any other establishment of its time, a place to rest, to eat, to water your horses before continuing your journey. But beneath this facade of hospitality lurked something far more sinister. You see, Patty Cannon wasn't just running a tavern, she was running a criminal empire. And her business, one of the most despicable trades in human history: kidnapping and selling human beings into slavery. Now, to understand the full horror of Patty Cannon's operation, we need to understand the time period. This was the early 1800s. Slavery was still legal in many states, including Maryland, but Delaware had begun moving toward abolition. Free black people lived in the area, working, raising families, trying to build lives for themselves, and they became Patty Cannon's targets. These were people who had fought for their freedom, who had saved money to buy themselves out of bondage, who had been born free and were simply trying to make a living. They had every right to travel, to work, to exist in peace. But to Patty Cannon, they were nothing more than dollar signs. The location of her tavern was no accident. Sitting right on the state line between Delaware and Maryland, she had discovered a legal loophole that would protect her for years. When authorities from Delaware came looking, she could claim to be in Maryland. When Maryland officials showed up, she'd say she was in Delaware. And in the confusion, she thrived.
Patty Cannon didn't work alone. She had assembled a gang, a network of criminals who shared her complete lack of moral conscience. Her son-in-law, Joe Johnson, was her main accomplice. Together with several other men whose names have been lost to history, they developed a systematic approach to their horrific trade. Here's how it worked. Free black people traveling through the area would stop at Patty's tavern. Maybe they were looking for food, maybe shelter for the night, maybe just directions to the next town. They had no idea they had just walked into a trap. Once inside, they would be drugged. Sometimes their food or drink was poisoned with substances that would render them unconscious. Other times, they were simply overpowered, beaten, restrained, and dragged into hidden rooms within the tavern. The tavern itself had been specifically designed for this purpose: secret compartments, hidden attics, concealed basement spaces, all designed to hide human beings who were screaming for help that would never come. And then they would disappear.
Patty and her gang would forge documents claiming these free people were actually escaped slaves. The paperwork would look official, the signatures would appear legitimate, everything would seem legal. Then they would sell them to slave traders heading south, where these victims would be forced into brutal labor on plantations, torn away from their families, stripped of their freedom, their identity, their very humanity. The profits were enormous. A single person could be sold for hundreds of dollars, the equivalent of thousands in today's money, and Patty Cannon had no shortage of victims. Men, women, it didn't matter. If you had dark skin and you stopped at that tavern, you were in danger. But here's where the story gets even darker, if you can believe it, because Patty Cannon didn't just kidnap adults, she also kidnapped children. Young boys and girls, some as young as 6 or 7 years old, were snatched from their families. Can you imagine a child ripped away from their mother's arms, sold to strangers, forced into a life of slavery they were born free from?
For years, rumors swirled around Patty Cannon's tavern, whispers in nearby towns, stories exchanged in hushed voices. Travelers who checked in, but never checked out. Screams heard in the night that suddenly stopped. Strange disappearances that no one could quite explain. But Patty Cannon had advantages that kept her safe. Patty Cannon was smart, dangerously smart. She didn't just rely on her location and society's indifference. She was careful, methodical. She knew how to avoid drawing too much attention. She knew when to lay low and when to strike. But the bodies were piling up. According to later testimony and evidence that would eventually come to light, Patty Cannon and her gang didn't just kill occasionally, they killed regularly, frequently, almost casually. Some estimates suggest they may have murdered anywhere from a dozen to potentially over 20 people, though the true number may never be known. Imagine meeting her at that tavern. She would welcome you with a smile, a warm, friendly smile that seemed genuine. She'd offer you food and drink, ask about your journey, seem genuinely interested in your story. And all the while, she was calculating, evaluating, deciding if you were worth more alive or dead.
Deciding if you could be sold or if you needed to be eliminated. And the bodies? They were buried on her property, in unmarked graves, in hidden locations, some in the woods surrounding the tavern, some right on the property itself, in places no one would think to look. But as careful as Patty Cannon was, she couldn't hide forever, because evil, no matter how clever, no matter how careful, eventually leaves a trail. And that trail was about to lead authorities right to her door. The rumors about Patty Cannon's tavern had persisted for so long, more than 20 years, that they could no longer be ignored. Too many people had vanished. Too many families had reported loved ones missing after traveling through that cursed stretch of the Delaware-Maryland border. Something had to be done. And in 1829, everything began to unravel.
A man came forward. His name was Cyrus James, and he had a story to tell, a horrifying, detailed, damning story. He had been part of Patty Cannon's gang. He had participated in the kidnappings. He had witnessed the murders. He knew where the bodies were buried. He knew how the operation worked. He knew everything. And now, whether out of genuine remorse or simply to save his own skin from the hangman's noose, he was ready to talk. His testimony was devastating, absolutely devastating. He described the operation in meticulous detail, how they would identify targets, how they would lure them in or simply grab them off the road, how they would forge the documents,
how they would transport victims, where they would make the sales. And most damning of all, he told authorities about the murders. He gave them locations, descriptions, names of victims when he knew them, details that only someone who had been there could possibly know. The authorities listened, and they believed him. They organized a search, and they began to dig. On Paddy Cannon's property, armed with Cyrus James's information, they started excavating, looking for the graves he had described. And what they found confirmed their worst fears. Human remains, not just one or two bodies, multiple burial sites, scattered across the property, hidden in shallow graves. Men, women, children, all victims of Paddy Cannon's cruelty. Some of the bodies showed signs of violent trauma, crushed skulls, broken bones, evidence of the brutal deaths they had suffered. The evidence was undeniable. The crimes were proven beyond any shadow of doubt, and Paddy Cannon's reign of terror was finally over. Or so everyone thought. In April of 1829, Paddy Cannon was arrested. Authorities took her into custody and transported her to the Georgetown jail in Delaware to await trial.
Newspapers were already writing about it. The courtroom was being prepared for the crowds. Witnesses were being lined up to testify. But Paddy Cannon had one final trick up her sleeve, one last act of defiance against the justice system that had finally caught up with her. On May 11th, 1829, just weeks before her trial was set to begin, guards making their morning rounds at the Georgetown jail made a disturbing discovery. Paddy Cannon was dead. She had taken poison, arsenic according to the official reports, and she had ended her own life in that jail cell. The questions immediately began. How did she get the poison? Some said it had been smuggled in by an accomplice who was never identified. Others believed she had hidden it on her person all along, perhaps sewn into her clothing, waiting for the right moment to use it. We'll never know the truth. What we do know is that Paddy Cannon cheated the gallows. She had escaped earthly justice. She would never stand trial, never hear the testimonies of her victims' families, never face a jury of her peers, never be formally sentenced for her crimes. She had chosen death on her own terms rather than execution at the hands of the state. In death, just as in life, Paddy Cannon remained mysterious, defiant, in control even at the very end.